It's theoretically possible, and I wouldn't blame any listener who is now at this point pretty cynical about the Roberts Court. I'm certainly a critic of what the Roberts Court has done, and they make up constitutional law all the time. And the Trump, one of the most embarrassing decisions and anti-historical decisions, anti-originalist decisions, was the Trump versus United States presidential immunity decision.
Welcome to Justice by Design, the podcast that looks to solutions to the problems we face as a country and a society. So, birthright citizenship, that's a concept that I think most of us, I know speaking for myself, often take for granted. If we are born on U.S. soil, we are citizens. But should we? President-elect Donald Trump has promised to use executive action to end birthright citizenship as part of his plan to crack down on immigration, which essentially means when he calls for more immigrants to be expelled from the country if they have children who were born here, he wants them to go with them. Well, but birthright citizenship is established by the Constitution. Can he even do that? Well, I thought the answer was no, but it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. So I'm so happy to have joining me Judge Sugarman, who is a professor at Boston University School of Law, my alma mater, and also someone who I frequently turn to explain constitutional concepts to me. So Jed, thank you so much for joining us on Justice by Design.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So just introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners. Tell them what you do there in Boston.
Sure. Well, I'm a law professor, and my specialty area, I have a PhD in American history. So I've studied in terms of some of these questions of citizenship. That's part of my historical background, and I teach a mix of constitutional history, torts, administrative law, federal courts, and I've been sort of generally a critic of the Roberts Court and its expansion of presidential power, which is one aspect of this question.
Yes, this is a big aspect. Just how much power does a president have? So let's back up and sort of start foundationally, right? Birthright citizenship is established by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So talk about how that came to be a little bit.
Sure. So let's just start with the text. It's the first part, the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. And just to give some historical context, the Constitution was dramatically revised after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And part of the point was to respond to the legacy of slavery and to the Supreme Court decisions that were shaped by the evils of slavery. And so that first sentence of the 14th Amendment is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So why did they have to write the sentence? Well, right before the Civil War, the Supreme Court ruled in one of its most infamous cases, Dred Scott. The first part of Dred Scott was a ahistorical, anti-historical conclusion that African Americans could not be citizens, regardless of slavery. Even someone who is African American in a free state did not have United States. It did not have federal citizenship. So this sentence was meant to overturn that ruling of Dred Scott, and not just to overturn it narrowly, but to resolve this question about citizenship as birthright citizenship. It wasn't just saying African Americans can be slaves. Let's just clear the deck and make sure this is clear forever after, that anyone born in the United States would be a U.S. citizen. So, Kimberly, let me just add one point, which is that they did add this confusing text to people who are reading it now, which is, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So if you have to be born in the United States, naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, what did that mean? It's actually quite clear. Anyone who's seen a movie about ambassadors or diplomats, I remember like Lethal Weapon 2, for example, but like, why is it that diplomats are immune from criminal law, like, from parking tickets or murder? and that's also why their kids can't be citizens. If you're a diplomat, you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So that
Right.
diplomatic immunity is one feature of not being subject to the jurisdiction. And we also don't want to run around making every ambassador's kid a citizen. So that's
Right.
all that phrase meant. But some people think, or have imagined, some in good faith and some in bad faith, that subject to the jurisdiction thereof does not apply to people who are undocumented migrants or undocumented immigrants. And
Right.
that's just not right.
So when I was in law school, Jed, I learned that the only way to change something that is established in a constitutional amendment is by going by the same method that created that amendment, which means amending the Constitution again, either repealing the amendment or amending it in some way. So why isn't that the end of the question about Donald Trump's vow to do it himself?
Well, there's another way to change the Constitution without amending it, and that's to appoint a whole bunch of justices who are going to overturn past precedents.
Yeah.
So that's the issue here. In terms of the original public meaning, in terms of originalism, in terms of the historical meaning of the Constitution, it's abundantly clear. And it's not only the original meaning when the ratifiers, but in an 1890s case, the Supreme Court applied this, and as a precedent, the Supreme Court's interpreted the 14th Amendment to establish birthright citizenship. That case is called Wong Kim Ark. And so, the Supreme Court has changed the meaning of the 14th Amendment and other precedents recently. For example, the idea that the 14th Amendment also protected privacy and reproductive rights, and precedents like Roe v. Wade. I mean, so the question is, has the Supreme Court personnel changed so dramatically that they might change this interpretation? And Kim, let me add one more legal aspect to birthright citizenship.
Please.
The same sentence was also adopted by statute by Congress. So it is in the Constitution, but it's also confirmed by statutes that strengthen this interpretation, because the statutes were passed in this meaning when birthright citizenship was the understanding of the 14th Amendment. So the Immigration and Naturalization Act, in its opening passages, 301A and B, if I recall correctly, repeat the same sentence, and because of that meaning, the statute has that meaning. But is it possible that the justices might also, not only change their interpretation of the Constitution and also completely revise and change their interpretation of that statute? Frankly, I think it's unlikely.
Yeah. Well, so let me play devil's advocate for a little bit, because the reporting is that the people who will make up Donald Trump's legal brain trust in the White House, either White House counsel's office or in the DOJ, will try to use an argument that the president has very broad authority over immigration policy. And elsewhere in the Constitution, not in the 14th Amendment, but elsewhere, the word invasion is used. And their claim is that, well, if this is deemed to be an invasion, then the president does have power in terms of his executive reach to take action that addresses any invasion on the country. So kind of pitting the immigration power against the constitutional citizenship right. What do you think about that potential posture for an argument if Donald Trump tries to do this and that attempt is challenged?
So it turns out their Constitution has an answer for that too. And it's a sentence that's been misunderstood or ambiguous sometimes, but the answer is quite clear. So the founders emphasized congressional statutes and Congress, if it decides, or if the Constitution decides something, then that has supremacy. There are really two answers here: that the Constitution and statutes have supremacy. And how do we know that has supremacy over presidential actions? There's a line in the article that establishes that the executive branch and the president, it's called the Take Care Clause, that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So a couple of friends and I Ethan Lieb and Andrew Kent wrote a whole article about that, the actual meaning of that statute. But here's the thing that's not controversial about that part of the Constitution, the Take Care Clause. It means that the president has a duty to enforce statutes, right, and constitutional law, and executive orders can't override. Or this is in England, it was called suspension. The king could suspend statutes as a royal prerogative. The American founders rejected that power of suspension. So here's another example where this comes up recently, not in birthright citizenship. Congress has just banned TikTok. Can the president just ignore that statute and make TikTok unbanned? No, because the Constitution says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Congress has enacted that law. Okay. Can President Trump just ignore spending statutes and defund the education department? No. Same reason. Given that the Constitution and Congress have been clear about birthright citizenship, the president does not have the power to suspend or disregard that law. Kim, on your question about invasion, that's part of Article 4, that if, and this is about the relationship between states and the federal government, on petition, if a state claims that it's being invaded, or if there's, they use the phrase domestic violence. I mean, are we going to be so flexible that, if there's domestic violence between, spouses, the federal government can come in and deport both people? No, that's not what domestic violence meant. When that domestic violence was insurrection. Invasion was clearly understood to be foreign and military. I've actually started looking this up because I might be part of, to be honest with you, there might be litigation coming up about this question. I've investigated it. It's clear that that undocumented immigrants do not constitute an invasion. It has to be in a military or insurrection context.
So I have spoken to you and other constitutional experts, and they all come to the same conclusion, that based on the text of the Constitution and the 14th Amendment, that this is not something that the president can do alone. This isn't even something Congress can do alone. Congress would have to be a part of it in ratifying a new constitutional amendment. But short of that, this isn't the way that the Constitution works. But as you said, all of them also said, but it's not up to us. It's up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I just want to go back to a moment to that precedent that you talked about from 1898,
right?
Which this was a case, the Wong Kim Ark case. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, but this was at the time that the United States had banned Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens in the United States under the Chinese Exclusion Act, a horrible racist policy. Let's call it what it is. But that was the law at the time. And when he went to visit his family in China, he was denied re-entry back into the United States. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this man is a citizen because he was born in San Francisco in the United States. Therefore, under the 14th Amendment, he is a citizen. Well, the Supreme Court, the current court, the Roberts Court, has been willing to overturn precedent before. And as you pointed out, it now has 3 appointees from Donald Trump. At some point, there could be even more. How might it be justified to overturn this precedent that has existed for 127 years?
It's theoretically possible, and I wouldn't blame any listener who is now at this point pretty cynical about the Roberts Court. I'm certainly a critic of what the Roberts Court has done, and they make up constitutional law all the time. And the Trump, one of the most embarrassing decisions and anti-historical decisions, anti-originalist decisions, was the Trump versus United States presidential immunity decision. But let me say, I would still be quite surprised, given how much precedent and how much this question's been investigated, that the Roberts Court would overturn, that you'd have 5 votes. Frankly, I think if I had to, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would say it would be 9-0 and or at the most 8-1 that would uphold birthright citizenship. Because I think that the Supreme Court At a certain point, they first of all, this is not, they don't have a big dog in this fight. They haven't been hardcore white supremacists. An example of that is, the Roberts Court on DACA. I mean, that was so Roberts himself voted to overturn Trump's rescission of DACA. Now that's just Roberts. But I would say that the originalist evidence is strong enough, and I just don't think that the court is looking to make a change so dramatic in this area.
So I take that point. I still remain worried, in part because we have seen them grant broader presidential powers, capped off with that really unprecedented, for lack of a better word, immunity decision. They've also been more amenable to Donald Trump's seemingly unconstitutional actions, or actions that go against federal statutes. This is allowing him, after 3 tries, to implement a ban on Muslims entering the country.
That's true. You're right.
It is overturning, in another aspect, Roe v. Wade, which was a constitutional precedent that had existed for almost 50 years. They seem pretty willing nowadays to overturn rulings that they don't like. And even I noted in my column this week for the Boston Globe on this issue that during his confirmation hearings, Justice Samuel Alito wouldn't even say. Usually when justices are nominated and they're at their confirmation hearings, the way they get out of admitting to things that they would love to see overturned is that they say, well, that's settled law, or that case is, that case is current precedent. He didn't even say that with respect to birthright citizenship. He just said, I'm not going to touch it because this might be an issue that comes before us. So now he's a part of a 6-3 he's a part of a 6-3 conservative majority that I am more cynical than you, Jed. I don't put anything past them. So the question now is, what can be done to make it less likely? Because, birthright citizenship isn't just a provision in the 14th Amendment. It is a foundation to who we are as a nation. It is a part of the principles that makes this country great, that if you are born here, you get all the rights and privileges that come with American citizenship, regardless of your race. That's why we needed the 14th Amendment in the first place. It was to end a racial discrimination when it came to citizenship with descendants of Africans who had been enslaved and forcibly brought to this country. We had the Supreme Court decision that came out of more racism, the decision to exclude Chinese nationals from citizenship in the country. And now we are again in the face of announced policies that seek to expel as many people, not all people who are in the country illegally, but certainly those who come from countries like Mexico and others to the south, or Middle Eastern countries. So what can be done to ensure that the Supreme Court, if it's up to them, sees very clearly that what Donald Trump is doing is unconstitutional?
Oh my goodness. I mean, what can be done is in terms of asking the question about citizenship, is to exercise our rights as citizens. I mean, and to speak out about this. I remember all of the protests, the Women's March in 2017 and the response to Trump's election in 2016. And I went to one of the protests in Boston, and I bumped into a friend of mine and a rabbi, and we decided to start an asylum support group. That's now the Newton Brookline Asylum Resettlement Committee. And we on the ground supported people who were fleeing. And isn't that what America stands for? Kim, I'd also say, the First Amendment is what America stands for, and religious freedom. And yet when there was a Muslim ban, and let me be clear, it was not a travel ban because it wasn't travel that was being banned. It was a Muslim ban because it was Muslims being banned for their religion. And isn't that what I would have said America stands for religious freedom, and yet there we were 5-4, Roberts voting in a way that I was shocked, surprised but not shocked, not surprised but shocked.
Mm-hmm.
So again, what can we do? I think it's about exercising our First Amendment rights and speaking out about this.
Yeah. So, just broadening this out a little more, we have seen with the first administration, as well as the way the president-elect has campaigned, that there are a lot of rules that he's not very fond of. We have seen this week with his cabinet nominees who seem to a person, be testifying not really to the members of the Senate who must advise and consent to their nominations, but really to the president, saying they are there to do his bidding. He is in charge. He is the one in control. So I guess more broadly, as we watch this, I know my job as a journalist is to not sanewash any of this, to not whitewash any of this, and
Yeah.
to try to just, as we're having this conversation today, state, okay, this is what the peril is, and this is what may happen, and this is what can be done if we don't like it, to try to stop it. I feel like I've never thought of myself, Judd, as a member of the resistance. I thought by going to law school, learning how the law works, following the Constitution, giving credit to rules and laws and provisions that I don't agree with because that is the law of the land, was the way to go. I didn't realize that having that same
Yeah.
position would one day put me as part of the resistance. But here I am. What should people in a position like me be thinking about? How should we be preparing ourselves to move into an administration which, in my opinion, is already stating um, their intention to, at least in some areas, be lawless?
So let me say two things about this, and this is for journalists, and this is for every listener. Which is, I was talking about, in 2017 there was mobilized support for asylum seekers, and to support them more, send a message that immigrants are welcome. There are sanctuary cities, and is it possible that a Trump administration could pull together the resources to deport I think the numbers we're talking about, like 11 million
Yeah.
people. That's not practical. So, but there are still, but whether it's 11,000 or 11 million, we're talking about a crisis. So one thing people can do is support cities and support places of worship. The idea of asylum actually is related to finding asylum in a religious house, and so protecting people who deserve protection, and also the idea of federalism that the conservatives say that they support also says that the federal government can't commandeer or coerce states or local officials to enforce federal directives. So there is a legal limit, but we also have to be on the ground supporting it, and supporting the efforts to protect people against the abuse of federal power. But here's something for journalists, and here's something for people who follow journalists: is how we cover this. And part of this is the crisis in the media of having sufficient resources. We're watching different major media companies who have fewer resources or are capitulating and kowtowing, like the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. How will the deportations be covered? If this is all covered as a crisis at the border, and seeing, with brown people at the border, then it gets easily racialized and it's lazy.
Yeah.
This is not a border question. This is a question that's happening in Boston, in Detroit, in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. Will there be journalists on the ground who then see people who are dreamers and who are not citizens being deported? The Americans support dreamers. The last opinion poll I saw is something like 75% of Americans believe that dreamers should be granted citizenship. Well, those stories need to be told, right? If what we're going to see with deportation is going to be the raids on people's homes of people who've raised families here and built and contribute to society, pay taxes, pay into Social Security, and then being stormed by ICE and then being deported as if they were common criminals. That needs to be covered, and that's what people should be paying attention to.
All right. Thank you so much, Judge Sugarman, for joining me to ferret out these constitutional and legal issues, but also the societal impact of what Donald Trump is saying he wants to do and whether or not the Supreme Court lets him. Thank you so much for joining Justice by Design.
Thanks for having me, Kim. I appreciate it.
So, I know that not everything will have a clear solution. A lot of the problems that we talk about on this podcast may not, and this is one of them. It really does, in large part, rest in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Although I wholeheartedly agree with Jed that we all, as citizens, have a role to play. We can contact our elected officials, we can protest, we can use our voices. But one thing I want to start emphasizing on this podcast, and I hope that you join me on it, is taking action. And it doesn't have to be something huge, it's whatever you can. I'm going to call them little acts of justice that we all can do. And one thing that I've been thinking about when it comes to birthright citizenship is something like this will not get the support that it has if we as Americans treat our people differently. How many times do you come across somebody, you may not know what their immigration status is, but based on the way they speak or the way they dress, you know that they come from a culture, at least, that's different than yours. And often, what are these people doing? They are working jobs that we need them to work. They are owning businesses and employing people in our communities. They are providing services. They are working alongside us. They are going to school with us or our children. And how do we treat them? Do we treat them like they're welcome? Do we treat them like we appreciate their contributions? Do we even make an effort to say hello and see how they're doing? I'm going to challenge all of us, myself included, to do more of that, to treat everyone, regardless of where in the world they or their families come from, as human beings first. That's American to me. And that is one of the acts of justice that I challenge you to do along with me. Thank you for listening to Justice by Design. We are here every week, my team and I from Politico, talking about these issues. And I hope that you follow the podcast wherever you get your pods and give us 5 stars so that other people can find it. And also follow it on Politicon's YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up if you really like it. That too helps us out. So enjoy doing those little acts of justice, and I will see you next week on Justice by Design.